Avoiding Legal Conflicts When Setting Up a Company in Singapore, part of the series Global Business Law in 20 Minutes with Federico Vasoli. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hey everyone, this is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney mediator and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Ołowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And Federico Vasoli, Italian lawyer originally, managing partner of the MTV Global with offices in Vietnam, Malta, and Singapore.
All right, thanks again, everyone. We're all back. And in the last few episodes, we briefly covered Vietnam, and we were talking about it in respect to creating businesses as a foreign investor, dealing with conflicts in Vietnam when you have your business, have issues and disputes with other contract holders in your business. And so we wanted to take a turn and discuss Singapore, a neighboring country. And so Federico, what about this neighboring jurisdiction of Singapore, and how are the issues we dealt with in Vietnam similar to Singapore? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mac. Great to be back. We briefly talked about Singapore in an episode when we wrapped up the takeaways for 2021. And I think I said it then, Singapore is the quintessence of efficiencies. There are many things that I don't like about Singapore, but for sure doing business in Singapore is easy. So it stands out as a very simple, business-friendly jurisdiction in the region, in Asean, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, composed of 10 Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam and Singapore. Singapore was actually spearheading this association, which is similar to NAFTA, in a way similar to the European Community, not the European Union. That is, it's a free trade area with common rules. No common institutions, though, mind you. There's no, for those of you that are familiar with the European Union, Natalia, and our viewers, there's no ASEAN Parliament. There's no single currency in a certain number of members of ASEAN and so on. Anyway, Singapore, as I was saying, is easy. It's a common law jurisdiction. So those of you that come from the US, from the UK, Hong Kong, Australia, India, New Zealand, and many other jurisdictions, will find it very similar to what they're accustomed to in their home jurisdictions. It's English speaking. It's a former British colony. So English is one of the official languages. All laws are already drafted in English, and that is a major plus. So even if politicians do speak other languages, so it's fascinating to see parliamentary debates or announcements by the Prime Minister that would start a speech in English, will continue in Mandarin, and will end in Malay. And the same happens in the Parliament. Anyway, it's standardized, it's simple, the jargon is pretty much the same. Yes, there are a few English words that differ. They say corporate secretaries instead of company secretaries. That is a minor difference. And then there are a few others. They call it constitution instead of charter. They call it, there are various terms that might change, but the substance is very, very similar to what you have in England, Hong Kong, etc. It's very lean. For instance, another major difference between Vietnam and Singapore is that you don't need notarized documents in Vietnam to set up a company. You just need to provide proof of address of the beneficial owners and directors and shareholders who are natural persons. You provide the corporate service provider, like us, with a list of 3 names at least in order of preference for the establishment of the company. And that's it. You need a registered address. Easy peasy. So it's easy. It's easy to do business in Singapore. It's a country where the rule of law stands. So again, much easier to go to court and solve conflicts in Vietnam, in Singapore. It could be, of course, any other means of dispute resolution, mediation, arbitration, etc. Essentially, the bottom line is it's easy, streamlined.
Thank you. And just a quick follow up. Why does, in your opinion, Singapore have such an outsized role considering its size? Because just looking at a map, it's at the tail end of Malaysia, and compared to Vietnam, which is a pretty big country, where does this legacy come from?
Very briefly, it's historical reasons. It's the fact that in the second half of the 20th century, most other Southeast Asian nations went through bigger or smaller troubles. Think about the Vietnamese wars, plural. Think about the coup d'etat that occurred in Thailand. Think about what's happening right now in Myanmar, Burma, and so on. In the second half of the 20th century, Singapore was led by one of the greatest statesmen of all times, I would say, Lee Kuan Yew. We might have diverging views over him, over his policies, over his personality, over the laws that he passed. Some of them were quite stringent and strict, but essentially he managed to bring up this small island, this small set of islands, to what they are now. As I said in the episode when we discussed the takeaways from 2021, it could be that the best is behind us because the other nations are catching up, and because of a certain closed-mindedness that might be shown with recent policies enacted in Singapore that restrict the number of foreign talents that make it to Singapore, which is quite common with the United States if you think about it. The US grew thanks to the large pool of talents that enriched the culture, the society of that country. And the same is true for Singapore. So there was no compromise, no hanky-panky business. Politicians are very well paid, so they are not prone to getting tipped off, getting side businesses and stuff like that. And they are selected through the best schools in Singapore. The school system is very efficient, it's very tough. So eventually you have a public administration that really works. Enough with pleasing Singapore anyway.
So when we were discussing Vietnam, we were naming 4 different types of starting the business. We can imagine being a foreigner and planning to take and make a footprint there. And tell me, is it the same in Singapore? Would you be considering 4 different types of businesses to establish the presence in Singapore?
No, in my experience, in the majority of cases that I have witnessed personally, foreign investors use the so-called private limited liability company, which is abbreviated as PTE Ltd. You might have seen that. Sometimes it puzzles people off. This is one of those differences that Singapore has in its jargon with other English-speaking jurisdictions. You normally see Inc. or LLC or Ltd. In Singapore, you often see PTE Ltd, private limited, which is a very lean way to set up a company. Essentially, you don't need a high share capital unless it is required by the banking system or you are in a regulated industry, but that's a different ballgame. With $1 Singapore dollar, which is roughly 60 cents, you can, that's it. You can have a company in place in terms of capital, excluding all the other incorporation costs, advisors, etc. So very simple. If you are in a regulated industry or if you have specific needs, you might consider other types of companies. But generally speaking, no, 90% of my clients opt for the private limited liability company.
All right. So, how does Singapore fit amongst its neighbors when it comes to ASEAN? So, is Singapore like a springboard to do business in other ASEAN countries?
By all means. Let me say something good about Singapore again. That is, Singapore is a multicultural and multi-ethnic society, and also multi-religious society. So in Singapore, all Southeast Asian nations are represented by people that maybe are second, third generations Singaporeans coming from Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, etc. So it's a melting pot again, where traditions are cherished. For example, schools observe holidays of all religions, of all the main religions. Let's put it this way: you have Diwali, you have Muslim holidays, you have Christian holidays, etc. So it's really a melting pot, and that's quite unique in Southeast Asia. That is, you do have other communities from other nations in the other member states of ASEAN, but they're not as representative of as many different pools as you can find in Singapore. So, for instance, in other Southeast Asian nations, you will find large Chinese communities. In certain parts of Vietnam, you will find minorities. You will find some Thais, some Laotians, etc. But it's not the same. Singapore has a vibe that is totally unique. So that means that Singapore, being first of all ahead business-wise, then ahead in terms of innovation, and then having access to different cultures, it is definitely the hub in the area. Plus, it's a place where the rule of law is really upheld. So, as expensive as it can be, this may be a drawback for Singapore. If you are right and you can demonstrate it, then you can win in court, which is not always the case in other countries, not just in Asia.
And back to how you operate when you are there. Of course, in any investment in a foreign country brings the risk of facing a conflict, a legal conflict, any conflict. And how do you think one can protect themselves from falling into any sort of conflict when setting up a business in Singapore?
Well, in this case, it's mostly common sense. That is, one peculiar booby trap of Singapore could be represented by the presence of local Singaporeans that may not be so clean in terms of intents, swindlers, but it's a minority. And also foreigners, don't get me wrong. I don't want to say bad things about Singaporeans necessarily. There is the really difficult part is vetting the local partners, provided you need local partners or local advisors. So now that I'm thinking about it and that I'm mentioning advisors, there is a very large number of corporate service providers, lawyers, accountants, etc. And some of them bank on very cheap prices to get the job done. I'm not judging necessarily based on this, but that could be a red flag. If somebody starts a social network massive campaign on how cheap it is to open a company in Singapore and how great it is to have a company in Singapore, maybe there's something shady about it. Maybe they don't know the nuances. A personal anecdote. There are still to this day, I live in Malta, but I'm an Italian citizen. Still to this day, there are professionals in Singapore that think that Malta is a city in Italy. Now, I'm not blaming them for not knowing it. I probably do not know the exact geography of many US states or even in Southeast Asia where I work so much. But I still see documents where they say my name, comma Malta, comma Italy. And that, when you have it on official papers, on documents, that is not professional, that is not so good. So you want to avoid those professionals that may start your business in a cheap way, but then things turn sour and turn bad. So selecting your partners, selecting your advisors is crucial when doing business in Singapore. Other than that, I wouldn't really find any big problems. One issue could be nowadays the opening of a bank account, but that is true all over the world. It is true in Vietnam, it is true in Malta, it is true in so many different countries. So you do have to have economic substance. So when I said before that one cool feature of Singapore is that you can set up a company with just $1 of share capital, the bank might not like it when they open your bank account. Or maybe they do, but you need to bring explanations. You need to specify what your turnover will be, what type of business you're in, etc. You need to go through a KYC procedure, which is quite common. But that is one thing. The other thing that I forgot to mention, on why Singapore is so great as a springboard for Southeast Asia is, of course, the tax system. It is one of the most advantageous tax systems worldwide, and it is compliant with the common reporting standards of the OECD. It is, to my knowledge, not blacklisted by anyone. So contrary to places like the Emirates or Caribbean islands, etc., that face these problems of compliance and of being blacklisted or grey listed, Singapore does not. Singapore is perfectly compliant, is very strict, but it is still convenient tax-wise. So putting your assets in Singapore when you do business in other Southeast Asian nations can be really convenient to protect the assets and to also have a tax optimization, provided it is justified. I'm not trying to lure people into setting up a company in Singapore simply for the purpose of paying lower taxes. No, they have to pay what is just. If there is this externalization, this positive externalization, which is to pay fewer taxes in Singapore because you do have a business there, a legitimate business there, that's fantastic.
Got it. And because of time, we in these podcasts anyway, we are always tempted to oversimplify. And so we always want to give as much information as possible in a short period of time. So briefly, if you're a layperson and you want to go ahead and open up and run your business in Singapore and you're a foreigner, can you give us a few pearls of wisdom that apply? And then how does all this compare to Vietnam?
It's very simple, really. It's there are not so many pearls of wisdom on top of what I said before. So what is necessary is simply to choose the name of the company, to have a registered address. Typically, a corporate service provider that helps you in setting up the company, like us, will also provide the registered address if you need it. You may have your own office, but you may want to start with in a cheaper fashion and just have a registered address where you receive your correspondence, which will be treated by the corporate service provider. So names, corporate service provider, the necessary documents, which are very simple, utility bills, proof of address, stuff like that. And there you go. Of course, again, knowing how the local mentality works is fundamental, especially when you have to deal with the older generations. But that's true all over the world. So there's no real pearl of wisdom that I would use here. Just select the right advisors. This is crucial because there are so many of them that falling into the wrong hands could be very painful to solve. So that's pretty much it. Choose the right advisors when you go to Singapore.
And then how does it compare to Vietnam?
Well, in Vietnam, there is less competition, and there are fewer foreign service providers, fewer lawyers, fewer accountants, etc. And the system is more complicated. So you cannot just go to Vietnam and invent yourself as a local lawyer or corporate service provider. The other difference is that in Vietnam being a civil law jurisdiction, the role of nominee director and even nominee shareholder is not really there. I mean, we do it from time to time when requested and at special conditions. But in Singapore, typically you have a package that is given to you by the corporate service providers. They provide you with the address, registered address, with accounting, with corporate secretaries that are the people, the professionals involved in keeping the minutes of boards, of AGMs, etc., and also with a nominee director. That is formally the person, the legal representative. We talked about confusion in names in Vietnam and Poland, that oversees the functioning of the company before the law. But as a nominee, sometimes this person doesn't even have access to the bank accounts of the company if he or she is not allowed by the client, by the shareholders. So typically you get a package. The problem with the package, again, we go back to the right advisors, is that the advisors may not know certain nuances. So they might not know that Malta is an independent country and not a state in Italy, and they might not know certain other aspects that are certainly much more important and could have a big impact on your business, not just in Singapore, but also in other nations.
And having said that, we would like to thank you so much, Federico, for the next episode, this time Singapore. It's really, it's not only time flying when we're doing those, but I feel like we are flying to those different places because you explain all these things so precisely, so figuratively. And it's easy to follow. It's easy to fall in love in these places already. So stay tuned to join us for the next episodes. And until the next time.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys, everybody, signing off. Till next time.